Hello and welcome to our channel. Today we're diving into a very special story, a journey filled with fear, mystery, and the supernatural. This video is about a terrifying childhood experience and a child's journey into the world of mediumship. Get ready, because we're about to embark on an adventure that will send chills down our spines. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a video. Now let's begin our story. My name is Lucas, but most people around me used to call me just Luca. The terrifying childhood years still haunt me like a nightmare. Although I never wanted it, thanks to my grandmother, I was introduced to darkness and the supernatural at a very early age. Back then, everything seemed normal to me. But now, as I think back and remember those moments one by one, I realize that these extraordinary experiences were far from normal. My grandmother was the greatest mystery of my life. She used to talk to me about supernatural things, but when I was a child, they only seemed interesting to me. I was 9 years old, and at that time I didn't have many close friends. It was simply more peaceful to spend time with my grandmother. She lived in an old house in a big town that looked abandoned. The dark forest around the house was always a source of fear. No one knew what happened deep inside that forest, but my grandmother would go there without any fear. She was so mysterious that when I looked into her eyes, I felt like something was always hidden. My grandmother used to say, "There are things, my dear, that can't be seen with the eyes, but you can feel them." Back then, I liked those words out of respect for her, but I didn't really understand what she meant. It was like when I was a little child, looking up at the night sky and seeing the stars, not knowing where they came from, but simply believing in their existence. Sometimes my grandmother would tell me to close my eyes and say, "Let's see, now feel." And at that moment, the whole house would fall into silence, a silence that would send shivers down my spine. Even though I was a child, that silence was more real than anything else. In a dark way, there was always a feeling that something was with me. During the time I spent with my grandmother, I started to learn something without even realizing it. My grandmother was teaching me things no child would ever be ready for. She was a medium. It didn't take me long to realize that. In fact, at that time, I didn't even know how powerful she really was. My grandmother not only talked to me about supernatural events, but also showed me ways to deal with them. One evening, my grandmother looked at me strangely and said, "Something will happen today. Something will be here to test you." I didn't understand what she meant at that moment, but everything changed after that. That night, I heard strange rustling from the forest around the house. As she always did, my grandmother lit a candle, closed her eyes, and remained silent for a while. Suddenly, it was as if time had stopped. When I opened my eyes, my grandmother was looking at me in a very strange way. "You're ready now, my dear," she said. I can't describe the fear I felt at that moment. Tears streamed from my eyes, but my grandmother came closer and said, "These will stay with you. Whether good or bad, you can't escape them." That was the moment when I first truly tasted fear. What my grandmother taught me were not things that a person could easily accept. But after a while, I began to listen to her words and understand what she meant. As I learned more, I began to notice the fearful looks of the townspeople. Somehow, the people around my grandmother knew she was someone incredibly special. But I couldn't yet understand how dangerous everything could be. because one day my grandmother told me that something terrifying was going to happen, and this event would change the entire equation of my life. The next day, everything seemed normal. My grandmother, just like every other morning, was preparing breakfast while I wandered around wanting to play childish games. But that morning, something was off. There was an unease inside me, like the whole town had suddenly darkened. My grandmother glanced at me from the kitchen, and there was a strange expression in her eyes. "Did you remember what you need to do today?" she asked, her voice so calm and deep that the words got stuck in my throat. I immediately understood what she meant. Those words, from that moment on, started to carry more meaning in my life. My grandmother had once told me, "The darkness inside something always finds the weakest point." At that moment I felt something was wrong, but I couldn't exactly figure out what. By 5 in the evening, the strange rustling from the forest began once again. This time it was closer, as if something was surrounding us. My grandmother approached me with a seriousness I had never seen before. "Be prepared, my dear. Now I will show you the most important thing I have to teach you," she said, signaling for us to go outside. When we stepped outside the house, the air felt different. The sky was gray, and the wind had stopped. There was only that strange rustling sound. My grandmother handed me a flashlight, and looking directly into my eyes, she said, "To carry out your first task, you must take the first step." At that moment I had no idea what I was supposed to do, but my grandmother's voice, filled with authority, made me feel like I had no choice but to do this. She added, "You must do this, otherwise we'll face something much bigger." Suppressing the fear inside me, I followed my grandmother into the depths of the forest. With each step, I could hear the wind howling, and I felt a strange movement among the leaves. After walking for a while, my grandmother suddenly stopped. "Be careful here, Lucas," she said, her seriousness deeper than ever. "A medium should always act not on what they feel, but on what they have learned. Now, close your eyes." I closed my eyes, but the world began to change instantly. In my ears, there wasn't just the sound of the wind, there was something else. Whispering voices, terrifying, groaning murmurs. But these voices weren't human. It was as if they were rising from beneath the ground. A wave of fear rose inside me, but I tried to keep quiet, holding tightly onto my grandmother's hand. Suddenly, something began to move towards me. I could feel it. A great darkness was rapidly approaching. Behind the sounds, a silhouette became clearer. But no matter what, I couldn't open my eyes. My grandmother calmly asked, "Can you feel it?" "I can feel it," I said, breathless. At that moment, I knew something was wrong in the world. Something was coming from the depths of this forest, and it was beyond my control. "You must stop it," my grandmother said. "Now, no matter what, you must feel this darkness. You have to feel this darkness." Suddenly, a dark aura surrounded me. It was almost like a deep void, and the entire world seemed to be under the influence of this darkness. The fear inside me was growing, but my grandmother's words echoed in my ears. "You must stop it." Keeping my eyes closed, I focused on the darkness. Something was wrong, but my grandmother had told me, "Now focus directly on that darkness." The thing in front of me seemed like the end of everything, but my grandmother was warning me. At that moment, I felt something watching me. But it wasn't just looking, it knew me, as if it had been waiting for me for years. In the middle of the forest, something shifted within the shadows, but this was no ordinary animal or human. Even with my eyes closed, I could feel its presence deep in my bones. My heartbeat quickened. My grandmother was still beside me, but I could no longer hear her voice. The presence of that ominous entity had taken over all my senses. And then I opened my eyes. It was there, at the darkest point of the forest, standing between the trees, staring at me, something impossible to describe. It wasn't human. It had no clear form, and yet it was so dense, so overwhelming, that the very air around it seemed to bend and twist. My grandmother took a step forward and reached out her hand to me. "Do not move," she said. Her voice didn't sound normal. It was distant, as if it came from another world. Not a regular voice, but a whisper that echoed. The entity moved toward me, a formless thing that had no face, no arms, yet somehow still resembled a person. It took another step, and then it spoke. But its voice wasn't a human voice. It was millions of voices layered on top of each other. Men, women, children, the elderly, all of them speaking at once. "We are here." My knees trembled, my stomach twisted. That voice didn't just echo in the air, it resonated inside my head. I couldn't even think, let alone speak. My grandmother gripped my arm. "Let it pass through you. Do not be afraid," she said. But I was afraid, because that thing wanted me. I tried to do as my grandmother said. I gathered all my courage and stood still. The entity came closer. Now we were almost face to face. If it had a face, it would be staring directly into my eyes. But it didn't. And then I realized something. The entity was slowly surrounding me. At first, I felt a chilling cold, but this wasn't normal cold. It was sinking into me. My heartbeat slowed. It felt as if all the warmth inside my body was being drained. "Don't let it," my grandmother said. But it was too late. That thing was pulling me in. The world faded before my eyes. My grandmother's figure became distant, her voice muffled. Suddenly I found myself in a deep, endless void. Just darkness. There was nothing. But at the same time, everything was here. Inside that thing I could hear countless whispers, voices begging for help, voices screaming, voices crying. I swear for a moment I thought I was lost, that I would be trapped there forever, that I would never return. But then, a voice, my grandmother's voice. "Lucas, come back." It was like a hand reaching into that endless pit, pulling me out. When I opened my eyes, I was on the ground. My grandmother sprinkled water on my face. I was breathing, but inside me there was an emptiness. The entity was gone, but not completely. It was still here, still watching me. My grandmother looked at me and whispered softly, "You have entered their world now, child, and you will never truly leave it again." My grandmother's words echoed in my mind. "You have entered their world now, child, and you will never truly leave it again." It was as if I couldn't fully grasp the meaning of that sentence. The voices were still in my head, the whispers I had heard inside that thing. But the worst part was the emptiness I felt, as if a piece of me was missing, but I didn't even know which part. When I opened my eyes, we were still in the forest. My grandmother was kneeling beside me, staring into my eyes. "Look at me, Lucas," she said. "Tell me what you saw." I tried to speak, but my throat was dry. My stomach churned as if I had inhaled something that didn't belong to this world. But then I realized I had. A darkness, I managed to say, But it wasn't just darkness. There were people inside it. They were talking, screaming, and my grandmother nodded, as if she already knew what I was about to say. And she urged. My eyes filled with tears. My throat tightened, because I didn't even want to say what I had seen. But some of them I swallowed hard. Some of them knew me. My grandmother closed her eyes. She took a deep breath. The lines on her face deepened. Then she did something I didn't expect. She stood up and began digging into the soil with her fingers. Fast, urgent, yet careful. She carved out a small hole in the earth and pulled a small pouch from her pocket. When she opened it, a handful of fine gray powder spilled into her palm. "Lucas," she said, her voice now sharper, "there are things I haven't told you." My heart started pounding. "What do you mean?" She locked eyes with me. "Did you give it a name?" A wave of cold washed over me. "What?" "Of course you did," she said. "The first time someone steps into that side, the thing that comes to them takes a name. The only thing that separates it from the rest of the voices is the name you gave it." I swallowed hard. I didn't remember giving it a name. But my grandmother was right. There was a voice inside me, and I knew that voice. I hadn't wanted this, but it was too late. My grandmother began drawing symbols in the dirt with her finger. I had never seen them before, yet somehow they felt familiar. Then she turned to me. "There is only one way to stop this," she said. "But if we do this, you will never be the same again." I started shaking. "What do you mean?" She looked at me. "Because you are now between two worlds, Lucas." Suddenly the air around us grew heavier. A whisper rose from the forest. "Lucas?" The moment I heard it, my legs nearly gave out beneath me. Because that voice, it was my own. My breath caught in my throat. My grandmother's face hardened. "It has come," she said. I turned around, and there it was, the same height as me, standing in my shadow, but completely black, completely shapeless. It had no face, but somehow I knew it was smiling. "Lucas," my grandmother said, her voice sharp and clear. "Now you must make your choice." But I couldn't speak, because standing in front of me was me, and it was just smiling. And so this is where the first part of our story ends. But this is just the beginning, because once some doors are opened, they never truly close. If you're wondering what happens next, part 2 is coming very soon. So don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. The darkness is watching, but are you? See you in the next chapter.